Okay, folks, welcome to our last session for the day. Is Mark 16:9 to 20 the authentic ending of the gospel according to Mark? To some people, this may sound like an esoteric topic, but if we're talking about Easter, the resurrection, the truth of the resurrection, it becomes very significant, as we will see. So you're reading your Bible, maybe your NIV, and you have the women go into the tomb. Do not be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And then suddenly, there's a break. You get a notice like this. The most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16:9 to 20. What does that mean? Does that mean the story ends at verse 8? The women leave the tomb because they were afraid the end? If you have an ESV, you'll find a similar message there after they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Some of the early manuscripts do not include 16:9 to 20. And so the rest of it you see is actually enclosed in double brackets there from verse 9. And you'll get a footnote there thinking about these different changes. And then if perhaps you're in the NASB and you're reading that, for they said nothing to him, for they were afraid. And suddenly now you see stuff in double brackets. It's now in double brackets, and there's a footnote directing you down to the bottom, and it says later manuscripts add verses 9 to 20. What's going on here? What's this later manuscript? It's not in the original. The story ends with women seeing a white man in a robe, an empty tomb, saying he's risen, go and tell his disciples, and they just run away and don't say anything. No, and that's where it ends? Is this where the story really ends? Young man, white robe, says, hey, no problem, Jesus up. They see the young man, they're alarmed, and there it goes. That's where it ends. And there's no resurrection. Through Mark, Jesus promised his resurrection 3 times, but it's not fulfilled. There is no risen Jesus. All you have is an empty tomb with a huckster in a white robe saying, oh yeah, sure, he rose. End of story. The only people witness even this much don't tell anyone to anybody. End of story. Makes the whole thing kind of useless. Surely it's not so. Surely this is not really the ending of the gospel according to Mark. And yet, this is the kind of stuff you'll read. This is from the Oxford Bible Commentary. The sequel to the story of Jesus' death and burial is in Mark's Gospel, terse and compressed. By universal consent, the sequel, as we have it, comprises only verses 1 to 8. Continuation of the narrative, either in a longer ending, shorter ending, or a longer ending, printed as verse 9 to 20 in some English Bibles, appear in some manuscripts of Mark, but these are clearly not by the author of the text of the rest of the Gospel. The final section we have of Mark's story contains only an account of the discovery of the empty tomb by the woman, with no actual appearance of the risen Jesus. The Interpreter's one-volume commentary on the Bible. The authentic text of Mark breaks off at verse 8, the continuations found in many manuscripts being clearly later additions. Technical study makes it clear that the longer ending, verses 9 to 20, comes from a different author and is based on Luke, John, and some other sources. Wow, okay, that's liberal skeptics for you. Of course they're going to say that. Surely our evangelical scholars will set them straight. No? In fact, the whole last 12 verses of Mark were not part of the original gospel, but were added at a later date and are not considered to be anything authentic. This means Mark ends with 3 women discovering the empty tomb of Jesus and being told by a young man dressed in a white robe that Jesus had risen from the dead. They said nothing to anyone, concludes the gospel because they were afraid. That's Lee Strobel, the case for the real Jesus. No resurrection. Who says this? You'd admit, though, that the final verses in Mark, which describe the resurrection appearances, were not part of the original text. Yes, I believe that's true, he said, but still, Mark clearly knows of the resurrection appearances of Jesus. Mark predicts the resurrection in 5 places, and he reports the testimony of the angels to the resurrection, the empty tomb, and the imminent appearance of Jesus in Galilee. So as long as you say someone's going to rise from the dead, it doesn't matter that he never actually does it, right? There's quite some chutzpah here. I think a far better view is that Mark was writing about the most unique individuals ever lived, and he wanted to format the ending of his gospel in a unique way in which he leaves it open-ended. He's essentially saying to readers, so what are you going to do with Jesus? Daniel Wallace. So it's actually better not to have post-resurrection appearances, we're told, because that way he's going to ask you, what are you going to do with Jesus? Well, you know what? My answer to that would be very different if Jesus rose from the dead compared to if he didn't. How can it actually be better without appearances of the risen Jesus? And if that's really better, too bad nobody told Matthew, Luke, and John. Maybe they could have left it off too. Do you guys really think that's a better view, to have no ending there, Mark? Or do you think it's a ridiculous view? Shabir Ali, our friendly Muslim debater, with James White. So you feel that the gospel, according to Mark, originally just simply ended with the verse which says that the women fled from the tomb and said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. James White. That has caused a lot of people a bit of a problem, but actually, given the situation that Mark was in and the fact that he was writing at high speed, I don't think there's any question, given Jesus' own prophecy of his resurrection, what the situation was at the end of Mark. What situation was Mark in? What does it mean he was writing at high speed? How do we know what speed he was writing at? What does that even mean? And he's writing at high speed. Like what? Oh, I'm at the bus stop. Oh, the bus is coming. I guess I'm not going to finish the story. And yeah, a claim that I'm going to rise from the dead without post-resurrection appearances, that certainly gives you a big question about the actual situation. What is going on here? Why is everybody so sure that the last 12 verses don't belong to Mark and that it doesn't matter? Folks, this may be your first and most important encounter with the field of textual criticism. So we're going to have to give you a bit of background on that before we go in specifically into the ending of Mark. Back around the 17th century, at the start of what's called the Enlightenment era, it was a period of a growth in prosperity and scientific revolution and developments in the Renaissance. Europe got richer, Europe got sophisticated, life got a little more comfortable, and it got to the point where the ethos now is, you know what, we're doing so well, we don't need God. We need to get rid of God. Man becomes the measure of all things. Reason, human reason and rationality is the only valid means to attain to the truth. Man is the measure of all things. While to enthrone man, God must be dethroned. Therefore, revelation is to be rejected in favor of empiricism. Miracles and the supernatural are ruled out. Scholarship must be utilized for full-blown assault on God and his revelation. And this kind of ethos led to what I call the three-headed monster, the weapons of choice for trying to discredit the Bible and convince people that the Bible is not true. These included historical criticism, textual criticism, and Darwinism, the theory of evolution. Most evangelicals are pretty familiar with the latter one. It's all over the place. And it's this idea that all life comes out of an original first cell, which by random natural processes developed into all these different types of animals. The driving force for this was not and never had been science. It was a desire to get rid of God and allow people to be an intellectually fulfilled atheists. Professor Edward J. Larson, the University of Georgia, Pulitzer Prize winning author on the topic and the world's leading expert on the history of the theory of evolution, in one of his lectures says this, and maybe if you're writing and had more time to think about it, he might have said it differently, but here he admits it. During the Enlightenment, during, say, the 1700s, notions of evolution began creeping back in, that is, creation by natural law. If a people are intent in pushing out God or rejecting divine causation, really it's the only alternative. So it was never about science, it was about getting rid of God. That was one of the heads of the three-headed monster. Another was historical criticism, the study of who wrote the books of the Bible and when and how and why, which would be very nice if they went with actual evidence. But as we've already seen in our first talk, this is not really the way it came about. It came about by making bald assertions, assumptions, presuppositions designed to discredit the Bible and ignoring the actual evidence. So they'll come out and tell you things like this. The gospel books are anonymous. They were written decades after the events they describe. Mark was the earliest one. It was written around AD 66 to 70. Matthew and Luke copied from Q. Q is the earliest source. Has no resurrection account. John was written in the 80s or 90s. All of these claims are A, wrong, and B, invented to discredit the gospel. Most of them are, though, accepted by most evangelical scholars. So that's historical criticism. But the one we're looking at now is textual criticism. There's another weapon wielded against the credibility of the Bible. In my opinion, it's the most subtle of the three and perhaps the most dangerous. Now, what is it? Well, it starts out with this. The New Testament was written in the 1st century AD. The printing press was invented in the West in the 15th century AD. What that means is for 1400 years from the 1st century onwards, the only way you could make more copies of a book, of the New Testament or any book for that matter, was through copying by hand. And copying by hand is a tedious, laborious process. And what's produced are manuscripts as handwritten copies. And it would look like these, for example. There's one designated P66 from the 2nd century. There's Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century. Codex 2813 from the 13th century. And when you look closely at one of these, you could imagine that you're trying to copy these. No spaces between the words, no punctuation. You copy page after page after page, eventually you are going to make some mistakes. No one is perfect. Now, for an example, here's an old copy called P37. And Matthew 26:28 there, where Jesus says, "For this is my blood of the new covenant," the scribe accidentally left out the word new. Or perhaps the scribe of the copy he was copying from left out the word new. It just actually dropped out when he copied it. And so this manuscript and everything copied from it will leave out the word new. And this is how it works then. You get the original manuscript, has no errors, and then you make copies, and they make copies of copies, and at some point a mistake will drop in. If you look at the 3rd row there, the one in red, the original says the only Son of God, they all copy the only Son of God. This one scribe accidentally left out the word only. And so every copy that's made from his copy reproduces that same error. And so what happens as time goes on, you get more and more errors in those thousands and thousands of manuscripts we have. Is it a problem? Does that mean we can't know what the original says? Well, it really isn't. That this is how it looks like. Yeah? What it looks like. Look at that bottom row. Somebody dropped out the word only, right? How many copies have the correct reading? 4. How many has the wrong reading? 1. Okay? That's the way it happens because you're making more and more copies. Each scribe might make his own errors, but they're unique to him. They're not in the other manuscripts. The other scribe might make a different error, but it'll only be in his, not in the others. What that means then is at every stage, you look at what is the reading. Okay? Is it only Son of God, or is it Son of God? Or is it only of God? Okay? What's the correct reading? What is in the majority of manuscripts? That'll be the original one. That'll be the correct one. And you can demonstrate that quite clearly with mathematics. All you have to do is compare the manuscripts at each point of contention. Whatever is in the overall majority is the original. Okay? But this doesn't undermine the Bible, doesn't allow for undermining the Bible, so we won't do it that way. The biblical scholars attest that's not how we do it. You have to follow our rules. And what are our rules? Well, Johann Salmo Semler, way back in 1725, tells you don't look at the individual New Testament manuscripts. Instead, group them into families: Alexandrian, Byzantine, Western, and then ask only which is the best family. Okay. Is there a problem with that? What is the problem? Because whenever you read apologetic books, they tell you, oh, we have like 5,800 manuscripts in the New Testament. We have this wealth of riches, so much more than a document. What they don't tell you is that, yes, we have 5,800 manuscripts, but we put them into families. And 95% of them are in the Byzantine family. And we say the Byzantine family is no good. And then we move on to Johann Jakob Griesbach. I have made up canons, rules for you to follow in picking the correct variant in each case. You don't look at what's in the majority of manuscripts. You don't look at what's in the overwhelming majority of manuscripts. You go with the rules that Johann Jakob Griesbach has made up for you. And Jakob Griesbach was a rationalist. And that's not meant to be an insult. It's a school of philosophy that says all true knowledge can only be attained by the rational cogitation of your mind. You don't need empirical information. So when he made up his rules, he didn't study scribal habits, find out what the real rules are based on evidence. They came from what made sense to him. So he made up his rules, and there are about 12 of them in his original list, but most of them are just restatements of other rules. It basically comes down to these 4 rules. There's lectio brevior potior, which means the shorter reading is to be preferred. So if you have a choice between the Son of God and the only Son of God, you should pick the Son of God because it's shorter. Why prefer the shorter? Because he said scribes were much more prone to add than to omit. So if you have a longer reading, it's probably because the scribe added something. He said he saw the Son of God. He thought, well, we want to be clear that he's the only Son of God, so we'll add the word only. Rule number 2, lectio difficilior potior. The more difficult reading is to be preferred. Why? Scribes were prone to correcting errors they encountered. So you come to a choice of readings, and one says that Jesus is deity, and the other one says Jesus is a basketball. You should pick Jesus as a basketball. See, because the scribes would correct the errors. They say, oh, Jesus isn't a basketball, we'll change it. And scribes were prone to correcting errors, which would mean that the original reading in the original Bible was an error. And it was later corrected by the scribes. Rule number 4, the reading that best explains the origin of others is to be preferred. Just pretty much restating rule number 3. The reading that differs from quoted or parallel material is to be preferred, for scribes were prone to altering the text that matches parallel passages. So again, they would come across and say, oh, in Matthew, Jesus says this, and in Mark, Jesus says this, but in Luke, he says something else. We better change Luke to match Matthew and Mark. What's the linchpin here? What's the one underlying assumption for all of these rules? And that is that scribes willfully and freely took it upon themselves to change the text of the Bible, to change what they believe to be scripture. The next step was the work of Westcott and Hort in 1881, where they convinced people that most of these manuscripts, 90% or more of all manuscripts, the ones they call Byzantine family, are corrupt and should not be used. The original text should be determined from the handful of manuscripts of the Alexandrian family. So these were the underpinnings on which textual criticism today is based. As Scott McKnight defines it as the science of determining as far as possible the original text of the New Testament and attempting to understand the reasons for changes. So looking at those manuscripts and try to figure out wherever there's differences, which was the original reading. I do notice that he says as far as possible. Modern textual criticism believes you cannot get back to the original. You can only get close. They call it science to give it a patina of authority, but it doesn't use science at all. In fact, it turns its back on scientific data handling like probability and statistical analysis. So if you ask me, textual criticism more like this: The practice of using the variants in the New Testament manuscripts as a pretext for inserting as many errors as possible into the original text of the New Testament and persuading evangelical scholars to accept and champion an original text that can no longer be considered inerrant. Now, that might sound like a nasty charge, but let's look at an example and see how this science works. Okay? One, ignore most of the manuscripts. Use only the Alexandrian manuscripts. Never mind the fact that they contradict each other right and left, and therefore cannot be the best manuscripts. Slavishly follow Griesbach's rules from way back in 1796. Do not use scientific data handling methods such as statistical analysis, and come up with an original New Testament text that has errors of facts and science in it. Now, what has actually happened since 1881? First, the Alexandrian manuscripts were shown to be corrupt. Hermann Hoske, way back in 1914, compared the two main manuscripts that the Alexandrian text is based on, so-called Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus. He put them side by side, thinking they would match each other very closely. He found that in the gospel books alone, they contradict each other more than 3,000 times. They cannot possibly be good. Either one scribe made 3,000 mistakes, or the other scribe made 3,000, and they each made 1,500 mistakes. They're very corrupted. Every argument Westcott and Hort raised against the Byzantine manuscripts was subsequently debunked. The concept of dividing manuscripts into text families was shown to be invalid. That's by Alland way back in 1965. And perhaps most importantly, it was shown that scribes viewed the New Testament books as scripture and would not deliberately add to or take away from what they were copying. Okay? We find that in the Didache and Dionysius of Corinth, Irenaeus, Polycarp, Justin Martyr. They actually feared what was called the inscriptional curse. You're familiar with the one in Revelation where it says anyone who adds this book, the Lord will add to him all the curses in this book, takes away from this book, God will take away his place in the book of life. They were scared to change it. They believed they were copying scripture. They would not take it upon themselves to change it. And yet, the very linchpin of all Griesbach's canons, as we saw, is that scribes just willy-nilly change the text to improve errors, to make it longer, and so on. And then this that they found would mean that the vast majority of scribe errors were actually accidental. They were not deliberately changing it. And this also destroyed Griesbach's canons then. And it was backed up by the fact that every study done on actual scribal habits since then confirms this fact. Accidental omission is very common. A scribe ever actually deliberately changing, very, very rare if it ever happens. Scribes generally try to be very careful, copy the text. Sometimes they were careless or incompetent, but they would not go around changing deliberately. Nevertheless, almost all textual critics today continue to use the Griesbach-Westcott-Hort approach, giving us an errant original text. Let's look at an example. If you look in Mark chapter 1, verse 2, this is what you will see. It is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you, will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. And then you see these little markers, A, B, take you to footnotes. So you look up the footnotes, you see Mark 1, that part there is from Malachi 3:1. The second part's from Isaiah 40, verse 3. And you say, wait a minute. It says it is written in Isaiah the prophet, but in fact, those two lines are not written in Isaiah the prophet. They're written in Malachi. That's an error. The Bible says it's written in Isaiah the prophet when it isn't. See this part? I will send my messenger ahead of you. Wait, that is not written in Isaiah the prophet. It is written in Isaiah the prophet. I will send my messenger ahead of you. Wait, no, that's an outright blatant error. On the other hand, if you look at, you read the same passage in the New King James Version, it says, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before your face. Well, that's true, the prophets, Malachi and Isaiah. Okay? This is not an error then to say in the prophet. So you actually have these two choices. It is written in Isaiah the prophet. It is written in the prophets. Which one is the original reading? Okay, well, first of all, And whatever is found in the vast majority of manuscripts should be the correct one. So let's go with that. Isaiah the prophet in 3.1% manuscripts. In the prophets, 96.7% manuscripts. That should settle it. The original reading is as it is written in the prophets, no error. Remember, that's not how we do it. You have to follow our rules. In this case, there's a problem for them because the shorter reading is in the prophets, so it should favor in the prophets. More difficult reading is to be preferred. Well, Isaiah the prophet is more difficult because it puts in an error. Best explains the origin as well. That's a soft. They can explain each other equally well. The reading that differs from quoted or parallel materials to be preferred. Well, that also favors in the prophets. So 2 out of 3 of their own rules says it should be in the prophets. The vast majority says in the prophets. But this is what you find in your Bibles today. NIV, Isaiah the prophet. NASB, Isaiah the prophet. ESV, Isaiah the prophet. RSV, Isaiah the prophet. NRSV, the prophet Isaiah. HCSB, Isaiah the prophet. New King James, in the prophets. And somehow it seems that for liberal scholars, the biggest rule is which reading gives you an error. That's the one we'll go with. Now, around the middle of the 19th century, this old manuscript was discovered in the garbage heap at St. Catherine's Monastery by one Lobegast Friedrich Constantin von Tischendorf. And it dated to about the mid-4th century, and that made it the oldest Bible manuscript we had at the time. As soon after that, it was publicized that the Vatican Museum had one that's a little bit older. Okay? Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus. Were they good manuscripts? Not really. Codex Vaticanus omits words or whole clauses 1,491 times in the Gospel accounts alone and is disfigured throughout with repetitions. Codex Sinaiticus abounds with errors of the eye and pen. On many occasions, 10, 20, 30, 40 words are dropped through very carelessness, and so on. These are not good manuscripts. And as I mentioned before, Hermann Hoskier compared the two and found more than 3,000 differences just in the gospel books between them. And yet the scholars went, wow, they said, these are the best manuscripts. These are the most reliable manuscripts. These are the ones we have to go with. Why? Well, these two manuscripts had something that no liberal scholar could resist. They're really the big thing that made them rapturous with glee. The left there is the end of Mark in Codex Sinaiticus. Look at that. The last 12 verses are missing. And on the right, you have the ending of Mark on Codex Vaticanus. And look at that. The last 12 verses are missing. Okay? Now, that's just too good for liberals, you see, because that means Mark has no resurrection. Mark ends his story with women fleeing from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone. There's no actual resurrection. There's some young guy in a white dress saying there was. That doesn't prove anything. Okay? At first, they treaded more lightly. They said, yeah, there was an end, but it was lost. We don't know how Mark really ended it. He didn't end it there. But then they eventually became, no, he ended it there deliberately. No new evidence to make that claim, but that became the claim that he just ended directly. For centuries, everybody knew it ended at verse 20. The pioneers of modern textual criticism succeeded in persuading most scholars that the long ending of Mark verses 9 to 20 was a secondary addition. The early textual critics were nearly unanimous on this. The large majority thought that the original ending of Mark had just been lost. Then they start floating the idea that, no, Mark actually finished his book at verse 8. He didn't intend to have anything. We didn't intend to have post-resurrection appearances because there weren't any. Started with 4 German scholars in the latter half of the 19th, early 20th centuries. By the 1960s, the number of persons who accepted that was about equal, about 50% of them. And then by the 1970s, it was weakened. By the 1980s, everybody said, yep, that's where Mark ended it. Mark, there was no resurrection. What caused this change in scholarly opinion? Why did scholarly opinion on this issue shift so dramatically? What arguments one day? There was no new manuscript discovery that demanded a reappraisal of Mark. No archaeological find or theoretical breakthrough. It was just new interpretive methods. Yeah. That's how textual criticism works, folks. So here you have your three-headed monster. And this is the thing, the heads work together. Okay? You need something more than no resurrection in Mark, because it's there in Matthew, and Matthew came first. So if Mark left it out, too bad. We already have it in Matthew. We already know Jesus rose from the dead. So we need something else. We can't let Matthew be first. We have to have Mark be first. Now, the evidence that Matthew came first is overwhelming. The early church fathers, people in a position to now discuss this at length, and there's unanimous consent that Matthew came first. So much so that even the most flaming liberal scholars didn't question this. Not F.C. Bauer, D.F. Strauss, none of them. Until you find Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus with no resurrection in Mark, we need it to be first. As Matthew C. Williams explains in Two Gospels for One, during the latter half of the 19th century, that means after the discovery of those two manuscripts, a new hypothesis took center stage. Renewed textual examinations reached the conclusion of Markan priority. Well, what are the renewed textual examinations? Well, you need new manuscripts for that. You had Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. We need Mark to be first, and on what becomes pretty much overnight in terms of scholarship, Markan priority took over. Mark came first. Why? Because it allows for this. Okay? Mark was first. Mark dates around the year 70. And Matthew and Luke, well, they weren't really independent. They copied from Mark. But the stuff that's in Matthew, Luke, and not Mark, there must have been another source they copied. This is your two-source hypothesis. Well, look, if Matthew copied, then his testimony is not independent, doesn't count. If Luke copied, his testimony is not independent, doesn't count. So what you have here, Q has no resurrection. It's the earliest source, has no resurrection. And Mark now has no resurrection. You don't get him resurrection until Matthew and Luke. Can you see how strongly this will undermine the case for the resurrection? It's a later legendary edition. It's not there in the earliest two sources. Never mind the fact that Q doesn't exist. No manuscripts, no quotes, nothing. Q doesn't exist. It's a figment of liberal imagination, but this is the picture that will give you. And most evangelicals will go along with it. If you look at the evidence against Mark, here's what you get. And you probably don't know how to read this critical apparatus, but if you look at how many manuscripts are actually leaving it out, there's just 3. It's right there in the top line. Only 3 leave it out. And really, it's only 2 because 304 is actually cut off. There's just Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. Now, there's a problem here as well, though, because these are very questionable witnesses, not just in terms of own quality. But here's the thing, Codex Vaticanus is a huge, huge manuscript. 759 pages long. And the scribe follows a consistent habit. Whenever he reaches, as you see, the leftmost column, there's 3 columns per page. When he reaches the end of a book, he puts a little subscript there, and then he moves to start the next column to start the next book. And he does this throughout the entire document. Finish one book, put a little subscript there, start at the top of the next column. Throughout the entire New Testament, this is what he does, except in one place. One place and only one place, and that's at the end of Mark. You see, he reaches the verse 8, he puts a little subscript there. Why doesn't he move to the top of the next column? Why does he leave an entire 1 1/3 column space blank? Unless he knows that it doesn't end there. He doesn't have the ending in front of him, but he's left space to accommodate the rest of the gospel book, to accommodate the rest of the verses. Otherwise, why did he leave the blank column there? He knew there was more to Mark. If you look at Sinaiticus, it's even a little bit more suspicious there, because in Sinaiticus, the original page with the end of Mark has been removed and replaced. And there again, you almost get an empty column. Not quite. But what this new scribe has done, he has started stretching out the width of the letters, the vertical width, so that he can get it just into that column and hide the fact that there's a whole column left there for the rest of the 12 verses. Look at how up and down, how thin the letters are on that top line, and compare that to the bottom lines. Stretched it out. Most likely they're in the original. Those pages were removed and replaced and made to look as if it was not there. Okay? You can see by comparing the width of the writing at the top and at the bottom. Okay? You see a difference. So Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are both missing Mark 16:20, but neither can truly be called an unimpeachable witness against it. The only other one, 304, is a commentary that's interspersed with this text and ends abruptly. So there's not one clear Greek witness against the last 12 verses. Here's how the manuscript evidence is. Okay? The claim you will see in your notes in your Bible, the earliest and best manuscripts of Mark are missing last 12 verses. You'll have statements like we saw, like some manuscripts include the last 12 verses and so on. The actual reality is that Mark 69-20 is present in about 1,700 manuscripts of Mark. It's absent in those three. And 304 is not really absent. And Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, as we've said, are questionable witnesses. It's there in all the rest of them, 1,700 or so. Okay? You don't get a hint of that really here. Now, there's lectionary evidence. The lections, excuse me, and they all have it. Okay? The versions. Okay? The claim is that some version is ancient translations into other languages, like Latin. The last 12 verses are missing in the old Latin Codex Bobiensis. The reality is present in about 8,000 Latin manuscripts and absent in only one. The last 12 verses are missing in the Sinaitic Syriac manuscript. Reality, present in about 1,000 Syriac manuscripts, absent in only one. And the last 12 verses are missing in about 100 Armenian manuscripts. Well, it's in most of them, actually. And the earliest one is from late 9th century, so it's too late to be significant. The last 12 verses are missing the two oldest Georgian manuscripts. Well, again, too few and too late to be significant. When you go through this, okay, you will see that the evidence from the manuscripts and the translations strongly support the manuscripts. And more importantly, you have early church fathers commenting on these. Okay? Irenaeus, okay? He actually quotes Mark 16:19. He writes in Against Heresies. Also, towards the conclusion of his gospel, Mark says, so that after the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sitteth on the right hand of God. Well, that's an exact quote of Mark 16:19. And this is by a church father writing in the 2nd century. Tatian included it in the Diatessaron, and that was the first attempt to write one combined gospel by putting the other four together into one. And that's around the year 175. Okay? Not even one church father ever said that the last 12 verses of Mark were inauthentic. Okay? So here's the thing. Church fathers from the 2nd century have it. Two questionable manuscripts from the 4th century don't have it. 17 manuscripts have it. Is it original or is it not? Yes, it is. Okay. They would say, yes, but the vocabulary and the style are not Mark. And 17 words in this passage that are found nowhere else in Mark. Okay? They'll give you arguments like this. The distinctively Markan word euthus immediately is absent. The distinctively Markan word palin, again, is absent. So they'll tell you that stuff. They'll be, okay, sure, by the external evidence, the evidence of manuscripts, we should say it's authentic, but there's all this internal evidence. The vocabulary and the style are so different. Does that sound convincing to you, this internal evidence? 17 words in this passage that are found nowhere else in Mark. We'll go back to the previous 12 verses. Last 12 verses of chapter 15, first 8 verses of chapter 16, 12. How many non-Markan words are there in that passage? Nobody questions its authenticity. It's 21. The historic present is absent in these last 12 verses. De is used as the main unit connector, whereas Mark prefers kai. And I'll admit, each of these by itself may not mean much, but the combination proves inauthenticity. Okay? Really? So here's just the nature of how language is used, but here's a very helpful chart for us. Those very points that they brought up, unique words, non-Markan words, euthus, palin, historical present, kai, and de. And he's picked like 12, 11 or 12 or 10 verse units randomly scattered throughout Mark. Look at 1 to 2, same number of unique words. Only once is euthus used. Palin's not used at all. No historic present. 14 times kai, 1 de. Look at 12, 1 to 11. 19 unique words. Look at 13, 4, 23, 15 unique words. 8 times kai, 5 times de. So you can pick just about any passage out of the Gospels, you'll find the same pattern. And nobody will say it's inauthentic. They'll make arguments like the connection between verse 8 and verse 9 and 20 are so awkward. Well, they really aren't. It really isn't awkward. The subject of verse 8 is the women, whereas Jesus is the presumed subject in verse 9. Right? In verse 9, Mary Magdalene is identified, even though she has been mentioned only a few lines before. Again, you have this all over the place. So here, Metzger thinks Mary should not have been identified because she was mentioned 8 verses earlier, whereas in the previous point, he complains that Jesus should have been identified, even though it was mentioned 3 verses earlier. Is Metzger even listening to himself? He points out that Mary was identified in 1547, 1 verse before being identified in 16:1. So why is it a problem to identify her 8 verses later? The use of anastas de and the position of proton are appropriate at the beginning of a comprehensive narrative, but they're ill-suited in the continuation of verses 1 to 8. Really? Complete rubbish. Proton appears 38 times in narrative portions of the New Testament. 37 of those times it is not at the beginning of a comprehensive narrative. So he says it should be at the beginning of a comprehensive narrative. It's appropriate there. 37 out of 38 times it's not at the beginning of a comprehensive narrative. It's where Metzger would say it's not appropriate. And as far as Anastas de having risen, shouldn't that go with the part of the narrative where he is risen, which is not at the beginning of the narrative? So these kind of arguments are brought up against the authenticity of Mark, and none of them is bogus. It's trying very, very hard to come up with reasons to say that the last 12 verses don't fit, because that is what is necessary to allow you to get rid of the resurrection. The other women of verses 1 to 8 are now forgotten. Well, it says he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. He didn't appear first to the other women. There's no reason that they should be mentioned here. They're not forgotten. Lita Kostner from Creation Ministries International buys into this hook, line, and sinker. It says some really silly things. Like, where did these different elements come from? There's that mention to they shall take up snakes. Okay, immunity to poison. It's not anywhere else in the gospel books. Now they're trying to tell you that's where it came from. And look at this. The immunity to poison and snake bites could be an allusion to Paul's survival of the snake bite in Acts. Yeah, are you kidding me? Somebody made up the later story. Ooh, I remember Paul, on one of the islands, he got bitten by a snake and then died. So why don't we just put words in the mouth of Jesus saying that people can drink poison and not die, and pick up snakes and not die? I mean, this is a logical fallacy up the wazoo, folks. Okay? So there's no material in the long end and don't have elsewhere. Yeah, taking up snakes is not elsewhere. Drinking poison by no means, it's not elsewhere. Okay? Even if it were true, so what? You look at the feeding the 5,000 in Mark, it doesn't have anything that's not in Matthew. Okay? So there you go. It's a conclusions. Mark 69 to 20 is the original end of the gospel according to Mark, as written by Mark himself. Out of the 1,700 manuscripts of the Gospel according to Mark, not even one is a clear witness against the last 12 verses. The most reliable manuscripts are anything but. The earliest evidence is the patristic testimony, which shows that Mark 16:9-20 was part of the Gospel almost 200 years before Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus were written. The evidence of the version solidly supports the authenticity of the last 12 verses of the Gospel according to Mark. The arguments from internal evidence are demonstrably bogus. The driving force then behind the push to deny the authenticity of the last 12 verses of the Gospel according to Mark is to facilitate the denial of the resurrection of Christ. Regrettably, the vast majority of evangelical scholars follow the liberal lead in denying the authenticity of this passage with disastrous consequences. The end. Thank you for tuning in.